Somewhere back in your family line, long before anyone carved a mark or planted a field, your direct ancestors met a different kind of human. Not a different tribe, not a stranger from over the next hill, a different species, with a different body and a different face. The far end of a separate line that had been branching away from ours for hundreds of thousands of years. And your ancestors did not only trade with them or fight them or pass them on the trail, they had children with them. Those children lived. They grew up and had children of their own, and the thread runs unbroken from that ancient meeting straight down to you, sitting here right now. For most of the time people argued about this. It was the kind of claim you could shout across a room and never settle, because it happened too long ago and left no one to ask. Then a small group of scientists learned to pull DNA out of people who had been dead for tens of thousands of years, and the argument was over. Whether humans ever bred with other species is not an open question anymore, and it is not a maybe. The answer is sitting inside your own cells as you watch this, and once you see how it got there, the clean single line you picture running back to one human origin comes apart in your hands. If you are enjoying this so far, hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I actually read them. Start with what almost everyone walks in believing, because it is reasonable, and it is roughly what most of us were taught. There is one kind of human, us, and there more or less always was. Other sorts existed back in the deep past, the Neanderthal and a few shadowy others, but they were a separate run of the experiment, and it failed. We came out of Africa sharper and better organized, we spread into every corner of the planet, and we replaced them. A clean sweep with no blending. And underneath that sits an even older idea, the one school hands you about what a species actually is. A species is a closed group. It breeds within itself, and it can only produce healthy, fertile young with its own kind. That is most of what the word is built to mean. By that rule, a modern human and a Neanderthal, having children who survived and carried the line forward, should sit somewhere between unlikely and flatly impossible. For decades, the people who study this split into two camps, one holding that we left Africa and replaced everyone with no mixing at all, the other that populations blended as we went. They fought it out over the shape of old bones for years and could not settle it, because a skull will only tell you so much. What finally broke the tie was not a better fossil. It was learning to read the genetic code straight out of the dead. Start with a Swedish scientist named Svante Pääbo, and a problem most people thought could not be solved. Pääbo wanted to read the DNA of a creature that had been dead for tens of thousands of years, which sounds impossible, because DNA breaks apart after death, and the little that survives in old bone is shattered into fragments and flooded with the genetic material of bacteria, fungus, and every person who ever handled it. For years, he and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig worked out how to separate the real signal from that mess, building clean rooms and methods careful enough to trust. In 2010, they published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, reading the genetic code of a vanished kind of human out of powder ground from old bone. Then came the part nobody was ready for. When they lined that Neanderthal code up against the DNA of living people, they found Neanderthal sequences sitting inside us. If your ancestry runs outside Africa, you are carrying somewhere around 2% Neanderthal DNA in every cell of your body, right now, as you watch this. That 2% is not a smudge or a rounding error. It is the physical record of the thing this whole video is asking about. You cannot end up with another kind of human's DNA threaded through your own unless, somewhere back there, your ancestors and theirs had children together. And those children belonged to both worlds at once. The mixing that left Neanderthal DNA in us seems to have happened not long after our species pushed out of Africa, somewhere around 50 to 60,000 years ago, in the warm corridor of the Middle East, where the two kinds of human overlapped for a while. That timing is why the inheritance is split the way it is. People whose deep roots stayed in Africa carry very little of it, and almost everyone whose ancestors left carries that 2%, a permanent mark left by a few thousand years of contact tens of millennia ago. And the pieces they left behind are not idle passengers. Some of the Neanderthal DNA we kept helps run the immune system, shaping how the body answers infection. A stretch of Neanderthal code on one chromosome was found by Hugo Zeberg and Svante Pääbo in 2020 to raise the risk of severe illness from the coronavirus, an inheritance from a vanished people that helped decide who got sicker during a pandemic 40,000 years after the last of them was gone. The cousins we wrote off as a dead end are not only in the family tree, they are in the medical chart. That same year, the same lab did something stranger still. In a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave, someone had found a single fragment of a finger bone, a piece so small that by eye, it told you almost nothing. Pääbo's team sequenced it anyway. The DNA inside matched no known species. It was not modern human, and it was not Neanderthal. It belonged to a whole third kind of human that no one had ever seen, identified for the first time not from a skull or a skeleton, but from the genetic code in a sliver of bone. We call them Denisovans, and we still barely know what they looked like because we have so little of them in our hands. For this work, for reading the genomes of the dead and finding lost branches of our own family hidden in the data, Svante Pääbo was given the Nobel Prize in 2022. Now you might think a person would only breed with a thing like that if there were nothing else around, some grim last resort. So hold the old cartoon in your head, the slow grunting brute, and set this beside it. In 2018, a researcher named Dirk Hoffman led a study that dated the thin mineral crust growing over painted images in 3 caves in Spain. The crust was at least 64,000 years old, which means the paintings beneath it were older still. And here is the detail that makes it land. Modern humans had not reached Europe yet when those walls were painted. The only people on that continent who could have made that art were Neanderthals. For more than a century, we called them the dim relatives, and it turns out they were marking cave walls with pigment something like 20,000 years before we arrived to look down on them. Their brains, measured from the inside of their skulls, were as large as ours, in some cases larger. At Krapina in Croatia, someone strung eagle talons into what looks like jewelry roughly 130,000 years ago. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal skeletons carry injuries that healed, broken bodies that went on living for years, which only happens when other people feed you, shelter you, and refuse to leave you behind. In a cave at Brunequil in France, someone built rings out of broken stalagmites roughly 176,000 years ago, deep underground in total darkness, which takes fire, planning, and a group willing to work together far from daylight. They made glue, heating birch bark to draw out a sticky tar, and using it to fix stone points to wooden shafts, a piece of chemistry that demands several careful steps and a clear sense of what you are after. In a Spanish cave called the Pit of Bones, Cima de los Huesos, the remains of at least 28 people, ancestors of the Neanderthals, lay heaped at the bottom of a deep shaft more than 400,000 years ago, which some researchers read as one of the earliest signs of humans handling their dead on purpose. At El Cidrón in Spain, the hardened plaque on Neanderthal teeth held traces of what they ate, and in one sick individual, traces of poplar, which contains the pain-killing compound in aspirin, along with a mold that makes a natural antibiotic, hints that they may have treated their own illness with the plants around them. These were not creatures you would mistake for animals if you met them. They were people, with fire and medicine and art and the habit of caring for their hurt. The wonder is not that our ancestors had children with them. The wonder is that anyone ever assumed they would not. And the Neanderthals were only one of the partners. The Denisovans turned out to be far more than a curiosity in a Siberian cave. When scientists went looking for their DNA in people alive today, they found it, concentrated thousands of miles from Siberia. People in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry as much as 4 or 5% Denisovan DNA, which is to say a separate kind of human, one we did not even know existed until 2010, bred into the ancestors of living populations on the other side of the world. So this was not a single strange event with one species in one valley. It happened at least twice that we can read clearly, with 2 different kinds of human in 2 different parts of the planet. And some of that inherited code still does real work. A version of a gene that helps people on the Tibetan plateau breathe the thin air at high altitude appears to have come straight from Denisovans, passed to modern humans through one of those ancient meetings and kept because it helped them live. A kind of human that left almost no bones still shapes how living people survive on a mountainside today. For years, the Denisovans were almost a rumor, a genome with no face, known from that one finger bone and a few teeth. Then, in 2019, scientists identified a heavy lower jaw from Baishia Karst Cave high on the Tibetan Plateau as Denisovan, reading ancient proteins rather than DNA, which placed them living in thin mountain air more than 160,000 years ago. A massive skull from Harbin in China, nicknamed Dragon Man, may belong to them as well. The rumor is growing a body, and the body keeps turning up in places that show how far these people ranged before they slipped out of the world. If this is making you think, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. This channel only exists because of the people who share these videos, and I do not take that lightly. And these two were not the whole of the company we kept. On the Indonesian island of Flores, in a cave called Liang Bua, researchers in 2003 and 2004 uncovered the bones of a tiny human, an adult who stood only about 1 meter tall with a brain to match. They named the species Homo floresiensis. The press called it the Hobbit. It was a separate human species that had lived on that island, by the latest dating, until perhaps 50,000 years ago, which puts it on Earth at the same time as us, hunting the dwarf elephants that shared the island and shaping its own stone tools. At a site called Mata Menge, stone tools and a few even smaller fossils show that some kind of little human was living on Flores roughly 700,000 years ago, which means this lineage held on, alone, on its patch of land, for an enormous stretch before it finally went. Then, in 2019, on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, in Callao Cave, scientists described yet another one, Homo luzonensis, known from a handful of teeth and small bones, clearly its own branch of the family. And in South Africa, in an almost unreachable chamber deep inside the Rising Star cave system, a team led by Lee Berger announced in 2015 a species they named Homo naledi, with a brain about a third the size of yours, whose remains lay in a spot so hard to get to that some researchers suspect the bodies were carried down there on purpose, in the dark, by their own kind. Behind all of them stands the longest-running human of all. Homo erectus walked out of Africa close to 2 million years ago, the first of our relatives to leave the continent, and spread across Asia as far as the islands of Indonesia. It shaped the teardrop hand axe, very likely tamed fire, and survived, in one form or another, for well over 1 million years, holding on in Java until perhaps 100,000 years ago. Set that against our own species, which has existed for something like 300,000 years so far. The reason all of this matters to the question of breeding is simple. Our ancestors did not walk into an empty world. The record holds more than 20 species in the wider human family, branching and overlapping and dying out, a thick bush of relatives instead of a single line marching toward us. As recently as 50,000 years ago, there were at least 4 kinds of human alive on Earth at the same moment, possibly more, crossing different country and making different tools. When there are that many kinds of human in the world, sharing the same valleys and rivers and hunting grounds, meeting is not a freak accident waiting on a 1 in a million chance. It is ordinary. And where humans meet, over thousands of years, some of them pair off and have children. That is most of human history in one sentence. Which brings us to the part that should genuinely stop you. If these were truly separate species, the children should not have worked. That is almost the whole meaning of the word species, that the door between one and the next is closed, that you cannot walk through it and leave living descendants on the far side. And yet here you sit with 2% of one of them inside you, and entire populations carrying 4 or 5% of another. So one of two things has to be true. Either these were not fully separate species in the strict sense after all, closer kin than the labels suggest, or the idea of a species is far blurrier than the textbook ever let on, a set of lines that fade and blend at the edges rather than sealed boxes with hard walls. The honest answer leans toward the second. Out in the real world, the boundary between closely related kinds of life is often less a wall than a fence with gaps in it, crossable for a long stretch of time before the lines finally drift too far apart. Modern humans and Neanderthals had been separate for a few 100,000 years, which sounds like forever, and was still not quite long enough to slam the door. And the door swung both ways. One Neanderthal genome from the Altai Mountains, read closely, turned out to hold stretches of modern human DNA buried inside it, the mark of an even earlier meeting in which our kind passed genes into theirs, perhaps 100,000 years ago, long before the later mixing that put their DNA in us. The crossing was not one mistake at one moment. It happened more than once, running in both directions whenever these kinds of human found themselves on the same ground. So the clean rule you were taught, that a species keeps to itself by definition, turns out to describe a tidy average rather than a hard law. And the gaps in that fence are exactly where you come from. Sit with the question the old story cannot answer. If we simply outcompeted these other humans and won the planet by being better, then why are they inside us? You do not absorb the genome of a rival you defeated and replaced. You absorb it by meeting them, living beside them and having children with them. Children who survived and grew and had children of their own, on, until here you sit, tens of thousands of years later, still carrying pieces of a people the textbooks filed under extinct. So what did the end actually look like for the Neanderthals, if breeding was part of it, rather than a clean defeat? There was probably no single dramatic moment, no last stand, no day the lights went out. Their numbers seem to have been small to begin with, scattered across a cold and shifting continent in little bands that never added up to many people. When the Altai Neanderthal genome was read in full by K. Proofer and his colleagues in 2014, it carried the marks of small, isolated groups breeding among close relatives, the signature of a people already short on numbers. Lay that over a climate that kept lurching between cold and colder, and you get populations too thin and too scattered to ride out a shock. Into that thinned-out world came modern humans in far greater numbers, and the two kinds of people met and traded and sometimes fought and had children together. A small Neanderthal population mixing into a much larger modern human one does not end on a battlefield. It ends in absorption. The distinct Neanderthal line gets folded in and watered down across the generations, until, as a separate kind of human, it thins out of the world, even as fragments of it ride forward inside everyone that mixing ever touched. They did not all die. A good number of them became us, and the same window that took the Neanderthals took the others too. The Denisovans, the little people of Flores, the Luzon species, every one of them slipped away inside the same long stretch in which our kind spread and multiplied, leaving only one human standing, and leaving its own genetic signature inside the survivor. Now sit with what that means, because it reaches further than the fate of any one species. For most of the history of Homo sapiens, the normal condition of human life was to share the world with other humans, not other animals, other people, of other kinds. And sharing the world with them sometimes meant exactly what sharing the world with anyone means. If you had been born 30 or 40 or 60,000 years ago in the right place, you might have known or feared or traded with or loved someone who was not the same species as you and was still unmistakably a person. Try to feel the weight of that. Somewhere in the deep past, a modern human and a Neanderthal stood close enough to read each other's faces. Two different kinds of mind meeting in the same cold morning, each one recognizing in the other, on some level beneath language, a person. We will never know everything that passed between them. Curiosity, fear, kinship, suspicion, and sometimes, the children born afterward tell us, something gentler than fear. That meeting happened countless times across tens of thousands of years, and the proof that it sometimes ended in tenderness is not a guess. It is the DNA, the living record of two species deciding, again and again, that the line between them was not a wall. Put the timescale on a scale you can feel. Squeeze the 300,000 years of our species into a single year. For more than 10 of those 12 months, other humans share the world with us, walking other valleys and burning other fires. And through much of that time, the two lines are close enough to mix. Only in the last 7 weeks or so does the planet empty out and leave us by ourselves, one kind of human alone, which is the odd chapter we happen to be born into and mistake for the way things always were. So come back to where you started, to the question that sounded almost like a provocation. Did humans ever breed with other species? They did. More than once, with more than one kind of human, on more than one continent, and the result of it is not a line in a journal. It is you. You are not one clean strand reaching back to a single origin. You are a braid, and some of the strands belong to humans the world forgot, people who were not, strictly speaking, your species at all. Look at your own hand for a second. The way your body fights off a virus, the cast of your features, maybe how your lungs would cope on a high mountain, some of that was written by people who have been gone for 40,000 years and who came from a different branch of the family. The other humans did not all die out there in the cold and vanish into nothing. A great many of them came home inside us and never left, which is a stranger and quieter kind of survival than the schoolbook ever offered. The border between us and them was never the sealed wall the word species made you picture. It was a line that people crossed over and over in the most ordinary human way there is, and they left themselves on the other side of it, in the bodies of the relatives who outlasted them. So the next time someone asks whether we ever bred with another kind of human, you do not have to reach for a study or a date. You can just point at the nearest person or hold up your own hand, because the answer has been walking around inside our species the whole time, hidden in plain sight, written in a code we only learned to read a few short years ago. Thank you for watching until the end. If this changed how you see something, check out the videos on screen. I think they will hit the same way. And subscribe if you haven't. See you in the next one.